Hi, my name is Aaron, and this is Old TV Cinema. Here is something I want you to sit with for a second. While you were watching your favorite kid on television every single week, laughing at their jokes, buying their lunchboxes, and maybe even writing their name on your notebook in middle school, that kid was possibly going home to an empty bank account. The shows were pulling in millions. The networks were popping champagne, and the child at the center of all of it, sometimes left with almost nothing. Today we are counting down 11 child stars who were paid nothing, or next to it, while their shows made millions. Number 11. Adam Rich 8 is enough. If you grew up in the late 1970s, you knew Nicholas Bradford. Round face, bowl cut, the kind of kid that made every grandmother in America want to pinch his cheeks right through the television screen. Adam Rich played the youngest of 8 children on 8 is Enough, which ran on ABC from 1977 to 1981. And for a solid stretch of that run, he was one of the most recognizable child faces on American television. The show followed the Bradford family, a large Sacramento household navigating everyday life, and Nicholas was the beating heart of it. Cute, lovable, endlessly quotable, ABC knew exactly what they had. Merchandise followed. Lunchboxes, posters, fan mail by the truckload. The show peaked at number 5 in the Nielsen ratings during its second season. That is not a small number. That is must-see television territory. So, what was Adam Rich walking away with from all of that? Well, the contracts for child actors in the late 1970s were, to put it diplomatically, an absolute disaster. There were no meaningful protections in place for minors in many states outside of California, and even California's Coogan Law, which was designed to protect a portion of a child's earnings, was riddled with loopholes that parents and managers had been exploiting for decades. Rich struggled deeply in the years following 8 is Enough. Drug addiction, legal troubles, a very public unraveling that the tabloids had a field day covering. He passed away in January of 2023. And when you trace the line from the smiling kid on that ABC set all the way to the end of his story, it is hard not to feel the weight of a system that never protected him the way it should have. Number 10. Kim Fields, The Facts of Life. Now here is one that I think gets glossed over way too often, and I personally think it is one of the most underrated parts of this entire conversation. Kim Fields joined The Facts of Life in 1979 at just 10 years old, playing Tootie Ramsey, the roller skating, gossip-spreading fan favorite at the Eastland School for Girls. The Facts of Life ran for 9 seasons on NBC, from 1979 to 1988. 9 seasons. That is a long time for any show, let alone one featuring a core cast of young girls who were growing up on screen in real time. The show was a spin-off of Different Strokes and quickly developed its own enormous audience. At its peak, it was pulling in over 20 million viewers per episode. Kim Fields gave that show almost a decade of her childhood. She was on screen before she hit puberty and stayed through her teenage years. NBC was not exactly hurting for money during this era. This was the height of their Thursday night dominance. And yet the standard contracts for young actors in that period, particularly for ensemble casts where no single child was considered the quote-unquote star, offered shockingly modest compensation with very little growth built in over time. Fields has spoken about going from the height of television fame directly into a period where the phone simply stopped ringing. The transition from child actor to adult actor in Hollywood is brutal under the best circumstances. Under the financial circumstances many of these kids found themselves in, it was brutal and broke. She rebuilt her career beautifully over the years, finding success in living single and later as a director. But the gap between what The Facts of Life earned and what it gave back to the girl who helped make it famous is a gap worth talking about. Number 9. Soleil Moon Frye Punky Brewster. Punky Brewster. Even saying the name out loud brings something back, does it not? The show premiered on NBC in 1984 and followed Penelope, nicknamed Punky, a scrappy, abandoned little girl discovered living alone in an empty apartment by a widowed photographer named Henry Warnemont, who takes her in. It was charming, it was colorful, and Soleil Moon Frye, who played Punky, was absolutely magnetic. Frye was 8 years old when she got the role. 8. And almost immediately, Punky Brewster became a legitimate cultural phenomenon. The merchandise alone was staggering. Dolls, clothing lines, accessories, a Saturday morning animated spin-off. Hallmark made Punky Brewster greeting cards. Let that sink in. Greeting cards. NBC and the show's producers were watching the licensing revenue roll in, while Frye, as a minor working under the standard contracts of the era, had extremely limited ability to benefit from any of it. The Coogan law in California was supposed to protect 15% of a child's gross earnings and set it aside in a trust. But the law at that time only applied to earnings over a certain threshold and had enough gaps that many child actors and their families ended up seeing far less protection than the law suggested. Frye has spoken openly and graciously about her experience, and to her enormous credit, she turned her story into something meaningful. She became a fierce advocate for child actors, and later directed a deeply personal documentary about her own childhood in the industry. She is one of the genuinely good outcome stories on this list, but that does not make the original situation right. Number 8. Danny Bonaduce, The Partridge Family. Alright, I have to be honest with you here. I went down such a deep rabbit hole researching Danny Bonaduce that my wife had to physically take my laptop away from me at midnight, and I do not even mean that as a joke. This story goes layers deep, in ways that the highlight reel version never captures. Danny Bonaduce was 12 years old when The Partridge Family premiered on ABC in 1970. He played Danny Partridge, the wisecracking, fast-talking middle kid with red hair and zero filter, and he was immediately one of the breakout characters of the entire show. The series ran for 4 seasons, crossed over into music in a very real way, spawned genuine hit records, and turned David Cassidy into one of the biggest teen idols of the 1970s. The show was a machine: touring revenue, record sales, merchandise, syndication. It printed money, and young Danny was right in the middle of all of it, delivering lines and stealing scenes week after week while ABC cashed enormous checks. What Bonaduce was left with at the end of it was not proportional to what he put in. The earnings from his time on the show were largely controlled and ultimately mismanaged, and by the time the show ended, he was a teenager with a profile that had already peaked and a financial foundation that was nowhere near as solid as the outside world assumed. The years that followed were rough. Bonaduce has been extraordinarily candid about homelessness, drug addiction, and the chaos of trying to rebuild a life after child stardom, with very little money and a whole lot of baggage. He clawed back. He became a radio personality, a television fixture, a kind of beloved survivor of the industry. But the runway from Partridge Kid to what came next was full of holes that should never have been there. Number 7. Emanuel Lewis Webster. Here is a name that deserves a lot more space in this conversation: Emanuel Lewis. And I mean that sincerely, because every time this era of television comes up, Webster gets mentioned as a footnote when it should be front and center. If you were watching ABC in the early 1980s, you knew exactly who this kid was. Webster premiered in 1983, following a young orphaned boy taken in by his late father's former football teammate and his socialite wife, played by Alex Karras and Susan Clark. Lewis played Webster Long with enormous charm, irresistible energy, and the kind of natural comedic timing that you simply cannot teach in an acting class. You either have it or you do not. Emanuel Lewis had it in abundance. At his peak, this kid was everywhere. And I do not mean everywhere in the way that publicists use that word. I mean genuinely, inescapably, unavoidably everywhere. He appeared on the cover of TV Guide. He was invited to the White House. He sat courtside at NBA games. He and Michael Jackson were photographed together so many times that the tabloids practically assigned them a dedicated column. Think about that for a second. This was Michael Jackson in the early 1980s, the most famous entertainer on the planet. And Emanuel Lewis was right there next to him, equally recognizable, equally beloved. The show ran for 7 seasons across ABC and syndication. 7 seasons. To put that in context, most television shows never see a 3rd season. Webster ran for 7. Families built their Monday nights around it. Advertisers paid premium rates to get their products in front of those families. The licensing revenue from Webster merchandise was substantial. This was not a modest little show that squeaked through on loyal viewership. This was a machine. Now here is where the story turns uncomfortable, and I want to handle this carefully because I think Emanuel Lewis deserves that. His mother served as his manager throughout his time on the show, which was not unusual for child actors of that era. What is unusual is what happened to the financial picture after 7 seasons of a hit network sitcom. By most accounts, including Lewis's own careful, measured comments in various interviews over the years, he did not emerge from Webster with the kind of financial security that kind of run should have built. He has talked about it with a quiet dignity that honestly makes the whole thing sadder to sit with. No outrage, no bitterness, just a man describing the gap between what his career looked like from the outside and what it actually left behind. And that restraint somehow makes the story hit harder than if he had come out swinging. Webster was appointment television. The kid at the center of all of it gave that show everything he had from age 12 onward. The network benefited, the advertisers benefited, the production company benefited. Emanuel Lewis deserved so much better than what the system delivered. That is not an opinion. That is just the math. Number 6. Melissa Gilbert, Little House on the Prairie. Now we are getting into territory where the numbers start to get genuinely staggering. Little House on the Prairie ran on NBC from 1974 to 1983. 9 seasons and 22 television films. Melissa Gilbert joined the cast at 9 years old, playing Laura Ingalls, and she was the emotional anchor of the entire series. This was not a minor show. This was a cornerstone of American family television. It was sold into syndication in over 100 countries. The licensing, the home video rights, the book tie-ins, Little House on the Prairie was a global brand, and Melissa Gilbert's face was the face of it. Gilbert has written with remarkable candor about her childhood in her memoir, and what she describes is a situation where the adults around her were not always working in her best interest. The Coogan Law was meant to protect her, but the 15% trust requirement left 85% of a child's earnings fully accessible to parents and managers, and not all of those adults were careful stewards. By her own account, Gilbert reached adulthood and discovered that the financial picture was far less rosy than it should have been. She has described periods of real financial stress that would shock anyone who assumed that 9 seasons on a top 10 network show translated into generational wealth. What strikes me most about Melissa Gilbert's story is how gracefully she has carried it. No bitterness, no public meltdown, just a woman who worked through the reality of what happened and kept moving forward. That takes a kind of strength that I honestly find remarkable. Number 5. Dustin Diamond, Saved by the Bell. Okay, Saved by the Bell. Saturday mornings, 1989 through 1993. Bayside. Hi Zach, Kelly, Slater, Jesse, Lisa, and Screech. If you are of a certain age, you did not just watch this show. You lived inside it. It was wallpaper for an entire generation. Dustin Diamond played Screech Powers, the nerdy, lovable, frequently humiliated best friend of Zach Morris. And while Screech was technically a supporting character, Diamond appeared in more episodes than almost any other cast member. He was there from the very beginning of the franchise, going back to the original Good Morning, Miss Bliss version that quietly transformed into Saved by the Bell without much fanfare. Here is where it gets genuinely uncomfortable. Diamond was reportedly paid significantly less than his co-stars. Now, compensation differences in ensemble casts are not unusual, but the gap here, by most accounts, was substantial. While the show was racking up enormous ratings for NBC and spinning off merchandise, clothing deals, and a cultural footprint that stretched well into the 21st century, Diamond was working under contracts that left him at the low end of a cast that was not exactly being paid like Hollywood royalty to begin with. Diamond struggled financially for years after the show ended, and I want to say this carefully because his later life had real complications and some very public controversies that were genuinely difficult to watch. But strip all of that away, and what you have is a kid who gave 4 years of his childhood to one of the most watched Saturday morning shows in television history, and the financial foundation it left him was not enough to build on. He passed away in February of 2021 from cancer at just 44 years old. And honestly, I find myself thinking about his story more than almost anyone else on this list. The gap between what Saved by the Bell became and what it gave back to Dustin Diamond is one of the starkest examples of this whole broken equation. Number 4. The Olsen Twins' Full House. All right, now I know what you are thinking. The Olsen twins? Are they not billionaires? And yes, eventually. But the story of how they got there from here is one of the most fascinating case studies in the history of child stardom, and the early chapter of that story is not nearly as glamorous as the ending. Mary-Kate and Ashley Olsen shared the role of Michelle Tanner on Full House, which premiered on ABC in 1987. They were 6 months old when they first appeared on screen. 6 months. The show ran for 8 seasons, until 1995, and became one of the defining sitcoms of the entire era. Full House was a freight train of family-friendly content, and Michelle Tanner was its beating heart in the later seasons. Here is what makes their early situation complicated. As infants and toddlers, the twins obviously had no agency over their contracts, their earnings, or anything else. The money they earned was managed entirely by adults. Now, the Olsen family has generally been described as protective and responsible. And to be fair, their parents did ultimately set them up to build what became a fashion empire. But the industry-wide standard of that era still meant that the vast majority of a child's earnings were accessible to parents and managers with limited legal oversight. What the Olsen twins did next is actually the remarkable part, and I'll be honest, it is kind of the silver lining that makes the whole story worth telling. They looked at the system that had shaped them, understood its limitations, and built Dual Star Entertainment with a strategic focus that eventually made them genuinely wealthy on their own terms. They took the name recognition that Full House handed them and turned it into something the show's producers never anticipated. That is not a small thing. That is savvy, bordering on extraordinary. But they did it in spite of the system, not because of it. Number 3. Dana Plato Different Strokes. We have arrived at different strokes territory, and I need you to stay with me here because we are going to spend 3 entries on this one show, and there is a reason for that. No single series in the history of American television more completely illustrates the destruction that the industry was capable of inflicting on child actors than Different Strokes. It practically has its own Wikipedia category. Dana Plato played Kimberly Drummond, the teenage daughter of Philip Drummond, who essentially became an older sister figure to Arnold and Willis after their adoption. She was 15 when the show premiered in 1978 on NBC. And while she was not the breakout star of the series in the way that Gary Coleman was, she was a central cast member for 5 seasons of a top 10 network show. Plato's story is one that I find almost impossible to tell without feeling the weight of it pressing down. She was let go from the show in 1984 after becoming pregnant, which by itself tells you something ugly about how the industry viewed its young female performers. The message was clear: you are replaceable and your value is conditional. What followed was a genuinely heartbreaking spiral: financial struggles, substance abuse, legal troubles, a robbery conviction in 1991 that made national headlines. She appeared on The Howard Stern Show in ways that, looking back, feel more like exploitation than entertainment. She passed away in May of 1999, at just 34 years old. I have been sitting with this part of the story for a while before including it, because I wanted to make sure I gave it the weight it deserves, rather than just rattling off the facts. Dana Plato was a young woman who deserved a support system, financial stability, and the kind of industry infrastructure that simply did not exist for her. The network made money, the producers made money, and Dana Plato was left entirely on her own. Number 2. Todd Bridges, Different Strokes. Todd Bridges played Willis Jackson, the older of the 2 brothers adopted by Philip Drummond, and in many ways, he was the dramatic conscience of the entire show. Where Arnold delivered the punchlines, Willis delivered the emotional weight. He was the one who remembered where they came from, who carried the tension of adjusting to a world that was not built for them, and who made you actually believe the stakes. Bridges was 13 when the show started. He gave it 8 seasons. 8 seasons of his childhood and teenage years poured into a show that NBC leaned on heavily during some very competitive television seasons. And when the show ended in 1986, Bridges walked away without the financial cushion that 8 years of network television should have guaranteed. His story in the years after Different Strokes is well documented, and he has told it himself with unflinching honesty: drug addiction, a criminal trial, a very real unraveling that played out publicly at a time when the tabloid media treated it as entertainment rather than as the crisis it actually was. What I think people miss about Todd Bridges is how hard he fought to come back. He has been clean for decades. He wrote a memoir. He has spoken at schools and community events. He turned his story into something useful. But the infrastructure that could have protected him as a child, financial protections, mental health support, real guidance from the adults in positions of power around him, was not there. And the show that made NBC money week after week left him to figure that out alone. Number 1. Gary Coleman, Different Strokes. And here we are, number 1. And honestly, this is the one that started the whole conversation for me. I actually called my mom after spending an evening going deep on Gary Coleman's story, because I knew she had watched Different Strokes from the very beginning, and I needed to talk to someone who remembered what it felt like to watch him every week. Gary Coleman was 10 years old when Different Strokes premiered on NBC in November of 1978. He played Arnold Jackson, the fast-talking, quick-witted little brother whose catchphrase, "What you talking about, Willis?" became one of the most repeated lines in the history of American television. Not one of the most repeated lines that year, one of the most repeated lines ever. That is not hyperbole. That is documented cultural history. Different Strokes was a phenomenon. At its peak, it was watched by over 30 million people per week. 30 million. Coleman was on lunchboxes, on magazine covers, on posters in children's bedrooms from coast to coast. He appeared on talk shows, at charity events, at the White House. He was as famous as a child actor could possibly be in 1979 and 1980. And there was a real argument to be made that he was one of the most famous people in America, full stop, regardless of age. What was happening behind the scenes is where the story turns hard. Coleman's parents, along with his manager, had been collecting his earnings throughout his run on the show. The money flowed in and it flowed right back out through a combination of mismanagement, questionable financial decisions, and, in Coleman's own telling, outright theft. He eventually sued his parents and his former manager in the mid-1990s, and he won. A judge awarded him approximately $3.5 million in damages. $3.5 million. For a career that generated many, many times that amount for the people around him. But here's the part that genuinely keeps me up at night. Coleman never fully collected on that judgment. Legal fees consumed a substantial portion of it. And by the time he reached adulthood, the boy who had been one of the most bankable names in television was working as a security guard in Utah. Security guard. Not a stepping stone job. Not a brief detour. He was working security because he needed the income. This is the kind of thing that, once you see it, completely changes how you understood everything that came before it. Every rerun you watched, every time you laughed at that catchphrase, there is a kid on the other side of that screen whose earnings were being collected by the adults in his life, and who would spend the rest of his life trying to get back something that should never have been taken from him. Coleman passed away in May of 2010, at just 42 years old, following a brain hemorrhage. He had been dealing with serious health complications his entire life. A congenital kidney disease that had required multiple transplants and contributed to the small stature that had been so central to his on-screen identity. And he faced most of those battles with limited financial resources. The network made millions. The producers made millions. The merchandise deals, the syndication, the international broadcast rights. The machine that was built around Gary Coleman generated an almost incalculable amount of money for a lot of people. And the boy who made all of it possible died at 42 with almost none of it. If there is a number 1 on this list, it is Gary Coleman. Not because his case is the only one that matters, but because no other single story makes the failure of the system quite this impossible to look away from. And that is our list. 11 child stars. 11 kids who showed up, did the work, made people laugh, made networks rich, and in too many cases, walked away with far less than they deserved. Now, things have changed. The Coogan Law has been significantly strengthened over the years, particularly in California, and other states have adopted similar protections. Awareness around child actor welfare is higher than it has ever been. But the history is the history, and these stories deserve to be told clearly and without looking away. If this video hit differently than you expected, drop a comment below and tell me which story affected you most. And if you are new here, go ahead and subscribe to Old TV Cinema, because we do not shy away from the complicated parts. We think the complicated parts are exactly where the real story lives. Thanks for watching. We will see you next time.